Welcome to the HFR Podcast. My name is Aneeqa Aqeel and I lead HFR Media. HFR is the established global leader in hedge fund data and analysis since 1992. To learn more, visit hfr.com. If there's one name you've read and heard a lot in the last month or more, it's Claudia Sahm. Claudia is chief economist at New Century Advisors and holds a PhD in macroeconomics from University of Michigan at Ann Arbor. Go Blue. I am delighted to welcome you to the show, Claudia.
Delighted to be here.
Well, prior to joining New Century Advisors, you've been on the front lines of economic policy making, where you developed the recessionary indicator known as the Sahm Rule. Please tell us about your work at the Federal Reserve Board of Governors.
Right, so I started at the Federal Reserve in the summer of 2007, so right before the Great Recession, and was one of the leads on consumer spending through that next 10-year period. It very much shaped my understanding and exposure to what recessions look like in the real economy, what recoveries look like, and not just the monetary policy response, being at the Fed, clearly we're exposed to that. Also, in my focus on consumers, I spent a lot of time on the different fiscal relief efforts that were put forward during the Great Recession and early recovery. And that very much informed my research and future policy work. I mean, the Sahm Rule was actually developed as a way to improve the timing, the delivery of fiscal policy in the future. The rule itself, the indicator of the recession, is very much the supporting actress. The star of the show is supposed to be doing better, more effective fiscal policy.
Absolutely. So let's cut to the chase. Is the U.S. economy really slowing down now?
The U.S. economy is slowing, and it has been for several months now in terms of slower growth. The question that is live right now is it gone from slowing to contracting, being in a recession, or close to that. The recession indicator, so the Sahm Rule, which looks at the unemployment rate, we can talk about its details, but it looks at the unemployment rate. We've had enough of a rise in the unemployment rate that would be consistent with past historical episodes of recessions. And yet, when you look broadly at all of the different aspects of economic activity, the information we have, the U.S. economy is still growing. So the Sahm Rule, the indicator I created, says recession. I look broadly at the data and I say no recession. There are people out there who agree with the Sahm Rule right now and say we are in a recession or we're very close to one. It's often difficult in turning points to really get a sense of, have we started to go into a contraction. The data, initially, early stages of recession, there's weakness, but it sometimes can be hard to discern. And then we have the added difficulty of the data that we have revised, and we have many reasons to be concerned about maybe the quality or the ability to interpret the data in hand. So it's a really messy picture right now. But my read as an expert in this area is no, the U.S. economy is not in a recession. I am very concerned about the degree of slowing, and we are pointed in the direction of too much slowing, a contraction. So for me, the recession odds are the highest they've been, and I've not had a recession on like this entire cycle. I was very convinced that we could get inflation down without the recession, but I'm certainly concerned. So it's a
right, and I think that's been probably the biggest shift in thinking for everyone, especially over the last week. So why was the Sahm Rule triggered? If you could just briefly expand on that, and what are then the cautions and the mitigating factors that you're keeping an eye on?
Right, so the Sahm Rule specifically looks at the 3-month average of the unemployment rate. So you look at the current value of that averaged unemployment rate and compare it to the low over the prior 12 months. If there's an increase of 0.5 percentage point or more, historically, the U.S. has been in a recession in the early months. So on average, about 3 months from the MBR's recession peak, or business cycle peak. And it has a perfect record since 1970. It has a very good record going further back. And in particular, I look at the data that we would have had at the time, so the unrevised, so the real-time data. The unemployment rate increases that we've had, and they've been occurring, well over a year at this point. They've been gradual, but this is not the July employment report, quote unquote, triggered the Sahm rule. It's now the reading is at 0.53, but the July report on its own did not get us to that threshold. This has been many months of a drift upward. Its purpose was as a trigger to automatically do fiscal support in a recession. So the proposal I had was checks, but you could also with like increasing unemployment benefits, you turn them on in the recession, then you phase them out. So it is simple by design. There are fancier recession indicators out there, right? A feature of that is it's assuming that those changes in the unemployment rate, they're coming from a decrease in demand or lessening demand for workers. The labor market is weakening, and that demand piece can then feed on itself in that like workers who don't have paychecks don't spend as much, and so then more workers don't get paychecks and don't spend as much. Now, there's another reason the unemployment rate can increase, and in particular, it can be if you have a burst in the supply of workers. Right at the beginning of the pandemic, we had millions of workers drop out of the labor force. Not get laid off, walk away from work. And we often will see decrease in labor force beginning of a recession, but nothing. I mean, this was so outsized to it. And then they didn't come back, many of them, when the customers came back. So we had labor shortages, which pushed the unemployment rate down. Okay, so that had an aspect that was both, we had a lot of demand, customers, but we were missing a bunch of workers. It kind of pushes down unsustainably the unemployment rate. And then we come into a time like now we've seen a large increase in prime age labor force participation, and particularly we've seen a notable increase in immigration into the U.S. in the last few years. And so a supply of workers, that will initially often push up the unemployment rate because it takes time to find work. And an immigrant group coming in, you have a group that's probably in any circumstance going to take longer to find work because they're getting established in the country. And then that is an increased unemployment rate. It is bad for people who are looking who don't have a job, right? So it's not like unemployment is a good thing. And yet the outlook is better in the sense that once the jobs catch up, if it's really just about that burst of supply, well, the jobs catch up, and then instead of a recessionary downward dynamic, we actually have a positive dynamic because we have more workers. Like that's one where the signal there is just very different, right? Because we've had so many of these supply disruptions, and we've seen them in the labor market. We've talked a lot about them in the goods market, right? In terms of the supply chains and just a lot of our macro rules of thumb, just by not being able to fully appreciate the breadth of the supply disruptions, gave signals that weren't as helpful. So the unemployment rate has increased. Looking at decompositions of reasons for unemployment among those who are currently unemployed, it's not just supply, right? So there has been a weakening of demand. So it's the Sahm rule is overstating the cooling off that we've seen in the labor market, right? We're not at recessionary levels. So it's much messier this time, as with everything has been.
As with everything, absolutely. So in July, late July, your Substack, you said, the Fed needs to stay ahead of things. Policy should not be reaction, it should be proactive, and the time to cut is now. Do you stand by that? Can you expand on that policy recommendation?
Absolutely. The case for the Fed beginning to ease interest rates is the progress we've made on inflation. And you can make that case just on the inflation progress. We're not back to target, but we're getting very close. And again, monetary policy has to be forward-looking, or should be forward-looking, because its tools take time to respond. And the Fed came into this year pointed at beginning its easing cycle. The early in the year inflation data were not supportive of that. I mean, I think there were good reasons at the time that are certainly being supported as we get further data, that the inflation data early in the year weren't giving us a good read on the underlying pace of inflation. When we do high frequency data, monthly data, there can be noise. The seasonality can be different, calendar effects, one-off effects. So now we're moving into, as we're going to get more inflation data here soon, we'll see if that kind of continues the path. But I think the Fed got delayed in terms of what seemed like a pretty straightforward path to begin gradually easing. I have questioned this year in this waiting for more good inflation data, which is fine. I can understand why the Fed would want that. And yet for much of that time, a refrain was, well, we have the luxury of time. The labor market is strong. We can wait for more data. And that was a really risky bet. The labor market is not the stronghold that it was even 3 months ago, 6 months ago. So the Fed needs to start moving. And at the end of the day, it's, the payroll gains have slowed. The unemployment rate has drifted up. Fed Chair Jay Powell, right before at the last FOMC meeting, said, we don't want to see any more weakness in the labor market. Of course, then 2 days later we did, but the Fed, we will continue to see weakness in the labor market as long as rates are high.
Yeah, and then add to that the fact that the Fed isn't actually operating in a vacuum, right? Last week was very exciting, and we'll get to that in a second because of the monetary policy being pursued by other central banks. Before I get to that, to what extent are US elections, the slowdown in Chinese manufacturing, foreign elections, and geopolitical tensions, to what extent does the Fed keep these in its sights when it is considering rate cuts? Because it will inevitably have an impact.
Right. So the Fed keeps an eye on as much as it can. I mean, to just understand the landscape. With the U.S. election and politics, the timing of various political events is not material, like say the election or when the convention or these kind of things is not material for a decision of the Fed of say when to cut. Right? Every meeting is live. Some might be a little more uncomfortable than others, right? But they are going to put their head down and do what they do. And the Fed as an institution always gets blamed, right? Yes. So no matter what they do, they'll have everyone angry at them, and they're a very good thing to blame, right? They can't stick up for themselves. So like the Fed is comfortable and aware of the fact that the best way for them to play it is just do their work and stay out of anything like they just don't get into the partisan. Just put their head down, do their work. And I think that's serve the Fed. So you could think, well, maybe the Fed doesn't want to get going in 2024 because they're concerned about what policy is going to be put in place in 2025. So I think that piece is they're not getting that fancy, right? They're, they keep an eye on these discussions, but this is not coming back into decision. Do we do 25 or 50 in September? Is what does predicted have on Trump versus Harris and this? That's too much. Right, when the world changes, if you go into a new administration and the policies change, they will have to adapt. And that's not a policy mistake, Sure. So I think that's one where they can kind of, until it's live, you're not going to see them reacting to that because it's too complicated. And then, but with the geopolitical, and any of that is in real time, right? So anything that would show up in commodity markets, or the Fed is very concerned still about anything that would be an inflation risk, right? So to the extent that you can have anything happening, say in the Middle East that would spill over into energy markets, and then obviously with financial markets.
So let's talk about what happened last week. I think most interesting, possibly for our audience, is the unwinding of the yen carry trade with the Bank of Japan raising interest rates for the second time. which really is a paradigm shift in Japan's monetary policy. Do you think that this is the perfect storm for the Fed? So you have currency pressures on the one hand, and you've got recessionary fears and questions about the US dollar's status as a reserve currency on the other hand. How do you think the Fed's thinking could be formed on this, and what might that mean for September and for the rest of the year ahead?
Thinking big picture, throughout the last 4.5 years, the Fed has helped navigate a very unprecedented, unusual. I mean, the pandemic kicked off a whole set of disruptions and a whole set of policy responses that were not typical, right? And we've really struggled with, I think, how long it's taken to unwind some of these disruptions. And throughout this, the Fed has worked very hard, maybe sometimes too hard. They're really working hard to kind of hold financial markets' hands through the process, not with certainty, right? I try to keep in mind, and I think this is preparing ourselves that we're not done with the volatility, right? Mm-hmm. This has been a wild ride, but if you step back and think about it, it is pretty remarkable how well things have come together so far. We did go through first of all, we went through a global pandemic, but we went through this cycle, very specifically with the Fed, where you had inflation shot up. We had a large, rapid, unexpected increase in interest rates. Inflation is back down nearly to target, and that recession that we were talking about for over 2 years never happened. Right. And so you have, but we're all waiting to get to the other side of this, right? And it's taken a long time. The exit strategy here is going to be messy, but I think this is where the Fed will continue to really push on. I mean, the two things that it's done so far is lean very heavily on data, and there has been an effort, and I think Powell is reasonably good at this, especially relative to his predecessors, at trying to explain themselves, right, and try and walk them through with markets. But we're seeing, once again, we are set up for, as we go into Jackson Hole soon, once again, what I think pretty clearly is going to be some tension between the markets expecting large cuts from the Fed and soon, and where the Fed would probably like to be in a more kind of cautious, gradual step in. So once again, and anytime you have these disagreements between the Fed and markets and the data are confusing, and then, you can have a few events that, I think that Friday, the employment report, that was, you set up a perfect storm because you just had a lot of other events related around it at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. So we all keep our head down and just keep watching, feeling our way. Well, this has been so fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing your insight, Claudia. I appreciate you taking the time.
Hey, thank you.
Yeah. We hope you enjoyed listening today. HFR is the institutional standard for alternative investing. Subscribe to HFR Media updates on our website. Follow our podcast for more exclusive content, and find us on LinkedIn and Twitter.